Welcome to FinThink's podcast, where we like to talk about all things to do with young people, neurodiversity and the education system. Specifically, we like to talk about alternative provision and how alternative education can be a real opportunity to create alternative pathways for those that don't fit the mainstream model. Cool. All right. Hello, Sharon. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to you sharing everything about what it is that you do. And I know there's lots of different areas, so feel free to dive into all of it or not, whatever you're comfortable with. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Shona. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your podcast this evening. Yeah, I'm quite excited to share what's been going on in my world since we met, I guess.
Yeah, so go ahead, tell everyone what you've been up to.
Okay, so I think I'll just start with the context, Shona, of how we met, which was over Facebook, wasn't it? And it must have been, was it 2 years ago now? Or
about 2 years ago, yeah.
Oh, gosh, so right in the bang slap in the middle of COVID, wasn't it? And I don't know who reached out to who, but we both recognised that we were working in property or trying to get into the property arena. And I think you were doing sourcing at the time, and I was just
not anymore, yeah.
And I guess that's kind of where we developed our and just shared our concepts. So you were telling me about this wonderful school idea that you'd got that you wanted to put together. And I think I hadn't quite finalised what my strategy was going to be around property at that moment in time. But let's skip forward a year. And really, because I've been stuck in this kind of unstable private rented accommodation and keep having to move house, because although I have a decent salary, I couldn't get my mortgage together because I just can't get the deposit. I live, and everyone goes, oh, why don't you move to a cheaper area? Well, I'm a single mum and my network is here. So why would I want to move up north to a cheaper area where I could afford a house? Anyway, that's why I got interested in property, because I was thinking there must be a different way of acquiring a house that then doesn't leave me in a vulnerable position, because literally we've moved house again for the 8th time in 9 years, because people sell and all that kind of stuff. And so that's when I started to research. But it was in January of, where are we, 2022? Yeah, gosh, January of 2021, when I started to think about more vulnerable client groups, because I can rent a decent house and I do have a decent salary. And I then met somebody who'd been in prison. And I'd never met anybody before who'd been in prison, but he was just sharing with me some of the struggles around accommodation and how linked it is to actually resettling in the community, because if you don't have a fixed abode, then you can't get the benefits and you can't get your employment sorted out and then you can't rebuild your family. And it just really all hinged on property. So that's when I decided to completely change my mind about what I was doing and not even worry about my own house. So I still rent, but try and develop a housing model whereby these guys, because primarily prison is full of men. We've got about 80,000 people in prison at the moment. The vast majority of them are male, and 50% of them come out. So, there's a lot of people needing housing. That's outside of all of the people that are currently homeless or stuck in cycles of addiction or whatever reason they're homeless. So I started to work through with some of these property strategies. Okay, what can we do? What really engages somebody in a house, and not just a house? It is a home, isn't it? Most people want a home. They don't just want a house or something to just reside in. So I started to put together a model whereby we would put construction skills and educational pathways, so improving literacy, digital literacy, numeracy, English language, as well as kind of the construction skills. And we'd look to focus on 1-bedroom apartment type, or, those kind of homes. And they'd be, that classic phrase, isn't it, below market value, whether you agree with that phrase or not. But anyway, they would require some renovation, and we'd put them through their apprenticeship, and then they would renovate that. We'd give them a little bit of a budget for their own bathroom. They can pick their colours. I live, and you can kind of see it from the background, I live in a white box. I can't decorate it how I want, so it's not my home. And what I really wanted these guys to feel was that this was their home. Mm-hmm. So as they were moving through their pathways to resettle into the community, we'd have an element of supported living as well. And so I kind of just started to working on that model. It's kind of a heart and soul type model. However, moving forward the months, I was still working full time in the NHS, because that's my background. So I was really struggling for time. But in discussing kind of meeting more and more people, suddenly I just knew loads of people then that had been in prison, because so-and-so was linking me with so-and-so, and then some were stuck in cycles of addiction and active addiction as well. So just starting to listen to some of their stories about their childhoods were absolutely heartbreaking. And this is a bit I really genuinely don't think that the public completely understands. And so, without being too triggering, but the worst kind of abuse that you could perpetrate on a child, male or female, coupled with neglect and physical violence and parents that were alcoholic or abstinent, it just made a recipe for disaster. And so a lot of these friends of mine that I now consider friends were saying, well, about the age of 11, I was glue sniffing in the woods to try and escape it, or I then hit alcohol, and then I hit drugs. And it was all about this story of numbing the pain. And that's when I started to understand more about the childhood trauma, the child adverse incidences, and the toxic stress. And because I come from the NHS background, I was able to understand about the neuroscience that started to sit behind it. And all of this I did, Shona, because I wanted to learn something new. I was so bored of spending 20-something years in the NHS. I really wanted to learn something new. So I became fascinated by the neuroscience that sat behind this childhood trauma, and what was going on with their brains. Why are they stuck in cycles of criminality? Why are they stuck in cycles of addiction? Why are their stories so heartbreaking? Why have they ended up in prison, and society's then just forgetting about them to release them with a tent? So they, public don't really understand, but because housing is such a crisis for this vulnerable group, that actually some of them are often released without any housing to go to, literally onto the streets and stuff like that. So the more I got involved in it, and the more I was understanding about the neuroscience, and then the fight or flight response, you can completely see how these guys and girls end up in the situation, because their brain in the formative years starts creating negative neuro pathways. And so it's like the cat that walks down the snowy track, or in your garden. I don't know if you've got cats, but they always do the same track. And that's how our brain responds to stress. It just completely continues to fire with all of our adrenaline and our cortisol down negative neuro patterns and neuro pathways, which then mean that they then can't work out how to manage their emotions. So they're triggered back into the fight response, and then that perpetuates the cycle. So I'm a bit rambling, but long story short,
you're not. I find it very interesting.
So I kind of put the property on one side, because then I kind of got, all this neuroscience, this is amazing, let's see what we can do. And actually, because of my own background of struggling a bit, not in the same context of trauma, but I had a very difficult divorce about 12 years ago now, and that's part of the reason why I'm stuck in this rental trap. And I'd had talking therapy, so I'd had the standard counselling, I'd had the antidepressants, but over the years, even though I felt I was better, I still kept getting triggered with tears. And I was like, why am I crying? I'm a woman of a certain age, so is it that? Is it just something else? And somebody introduced me to something called EFT, emotional freedom technique. And clinical EFT works on the neuro pathways. So it uses acupressure, and it's called tapping. So I don't know if anyone's been watching I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, because I don't watch that, but anyone else listening to your podcast might have seen it. Boy George is an advocate of it. And so when he was in the jungle, he was like apparently tapping on the various pressure points that we use. And so what that does with the neuroscience is it calms the cortisol very rapidly down in the body. And there's been randomized control studies with saliva and blood tests to see the impact of it. And so I had some of that, and it stemmed from a trigger in my childhood around abandonment issues and rejection that actually I've carried forward into my 40-something years. Yeah, loud. So I started to think, okay, and I researched that, and I found that the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE, who worked alongside the NHS, had recommended EFT in complex PTSD in veterans. So then I had a working hypothesis that if it works in complex PTSD in military veterans, it's going to work in complex PTSD associated with childhood trauma. That became my kind of, okay, let's develop a business model whereby I can do some group work with some trained EFT practitioners for these guys who are either in prison or probation, so out in the community, or however they're being managed. And let's see what we can do to help them manage their emotional triggers, so they're not responding in that same way that they have been, which is perpetuating the revolving door of ending up back in prison. So I put that together with a panel of lived experienced experts, so some that had been through the justice system, probation were on my panel, a prison GP, psychologists. So we created this model. I call it the Iruka project, and we've been running some pilots with what we call integrated offender management houses. They're like HMOs, but they have the police, they have probation, they have support workers.
For people that don't know what a HMO is, do you want to explain?
Oh, sorry, yeah, house of multiple occupation, which I have a real bee in my bonnet about for this client group, particularly. It just doesn't work, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Okay. Yeah, so we've been working alongside a charity that supports integrated offender management. And it's really fascinating, actually, because as soon as these guys understand the neuroscience, like we've been talking about, they suddenly realize why they've been behaving that way. And then they have a toolbox of techniques that then says, do you know what, if I'm going to be, I don't know, provoked or angry, or quite often it's a relationship issue, either girlfriend or wife or children, that might trigger them, that they've got these kind of techniques to help them calm down really quickly.
Okay.
So the next phase of that is that I'm hopefully from January working alongside a probation service local to where I live, to be able to do a much larger study using this business model and therapeutic intervention around potentially 70 cases. I hate to use the word cases, but it's a caseload, isn't it, in probation? But these are guys, people that we want to help support them and get their lives back on track.
Yeah.
So that then, of course, has detracted me from the property side.
That's okay. It sounds like this is way more interesting anyway. How do people get referred on to your pilot programs, or do you pick them out of, like, how does that work?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because at the moment with Iruka, what we're doing this Friday is kind of an engagement piece with the police force and the probation, just to talk them a little bit about it and just to see who might benefit. Because we've been running it in pilot phase on a much smaller scale, we've done a lot of learning. So we've had guys on there that can't read or write, and yet they're in their 30s, which again comes back to the educational piece with the property side. I was really passionate about, as well as increasing their literacy, that gives them the opportunity to then have employment. So there'll be an understanding really that what we can deliver in terms of the Iruka project, what its aims are, how we're going to follow up these guys, because we'd like to follow them up sort of 1 month, 3 months, 6 months post workshop to make sure that they're not going back into old ways, and just leaving it to the probation service really. They'll find the ones that they want to put through. These are often chaotic lifestyles, so they'll be trying anything, and there might even be court orders in place for some of these guys that have to do a certain amount of activities to show that they are getting their lives back on track. So I know some of them won't want to be there.
Yeah.
Always the challenge. That's the challenge, to get them engaged in it.
Because I can imagine, because I don't know exactly what it is, but I can imagine if you're like, okay, now tap here, tap there, like that must seem just so out of the world for some people. Yeah, I would give it a go. Sounds interesting.
But I think that's why before we go into any kind of practical exercise with them, we talk about their potential adverse childhood experience score, and what triggers them, and where do they feel stress in the body, because some don't even know they've been going through so much stuff over their years, and particularly their childhood, that actually that butterfly in the stomach is actually stress, whereas they might just feel that they feel a bit sick, but they don't understand why. So we teach them where stress manifests in the body, and that's really important. And as they start linking how they feel stressed, what situations they feel stressed in, something about, did they have the right level of nurture? Because we want this to be in a safe environment. We don't want to say, oh, by the way, you had the most horrendous childhood and we feel really awful, and that should never have happened to you, because it should never have happened to any of them to get to where they've got to. But we do it in a really safe, contained way, just gently explaining to them why they're doing it and things like that. So we haven't found anybody that's not benefited. If anything, sometimes I see the staff are disengaged and the guys are really fascinated by it, because there's always seems to be some staff that want to know what we're doing, which is absolutely fine.
I just want to try and link it to like what I do. So I work with kids in alternative provision, which are schools, well, they're non-schools for kids that get excluded, or they're at risk of exclusion, or sometimes they have special educational needs and maybe it's just better that they've got a different kind of atmosphere. Now, from what you said, they've got low levels of numeracy and literacy you were talking about. So there is definitely that link, isn't there, between if you have childhood trauma, then you might have problems at school, and then that leads to possibly not being able to get your good grades, or not even just the grades, but actually those basic skills. And then that increases your chances of ending up in the criminal justice system. Is that true?
Yeah. I think the group that you work with is a pipeline.
Yeah.
We hate to say it, but it's we call the school to prison pipeline, because we see it not just in the environment in which you're trying to support and working really hard to support to keep them out of that environment, but we see it in mainstream education as well. Kids that often get missed, sometimes they might be a bit quieter and they're vulnerable, sometimes they're a bit more outspoken. Many of my friends have said, you know what, when I was at school, all I was done was labelled as being bad. And actually, I didn't want that label, because then it gets perpetuated in the community. And it was more about, I just wanted people to ask me what was wrong. And then I'd have told them that, I don't know, my mum was drinking, or I wasn't going home, because school sometimes is a safe place for them. And I don't know in your area, but the care sector, so children in the care system, again, is another large cohort that unfortunately end up in the justice sector, again, because they don't have the right level of support, and because of all the trauma that comes with the fact that they are naturally vulnerable and in the care system anyway. So
it's interesting what you're saying. So like alternative provision is kind of like the pipeway to criminality, which is quite depressing. And I feel a bit worried actually that a young person might watch this that's on that road. But my intent is not that we're telling them this is where you're heading. It's a warning sign. This is the direction that you are heading, but it'd be way better if we work on improving your confidence to get over those kind of traumas, experimenting in different strategies to overcome that, so that you don't end up down that other end of the pathway. Because some parents and young people, when they get sent to alternative provision, they think that's the end of the road. They're like, oh, everything's over, this is terrible. No, it's not. It's the warning of about the end of the road in a few years' time. That's what it actually is. Is there any evidence of the tapping working with, like, how young can you start working on that?
Completely. From about the age of whenever they become a bit more self-aware. So out in the States, it's being used in schools actually. So primary school age, 6, 7, probably as young as 5. Because I'm not focused on the educational sector, I've not looked into it in that level of detail. I've just seen videos of children out in the States using it. And we have had a couple of charities focused on care experienced children and care leavers to say, can you come and do some work with our client group, because we're concerned, because it is just about how they manage their emotions. You see it, they explode, don't they, because they're so full of I don't know, anger or shame or guilt or whatever has caused them to get to that position. It's really sad, but they just don't know how to manage that regulation. It just erupts, and I see it in my personal life with, without going into too much detail, with my lovely daughter. She just explodes, and then you just, sometimes as a parent, the red mist comes down yourself, and you think, well, how am I going to manage this disrespectful behaviour? But actually, at the end of the day, they just need the love, and they need the loving boundary. Sorry, I did go off on a tangent because I'm quite passionate about that, because that's what this is about, loving these guys into, letting them feel that they're being listened to and feel that they're being supported to get them back on track.
And again, without going into too much detail, we were talking a little bit before about how sometimes the person that asks them what's wrong can't necessarily be an immediate family member because they're too close to them. And it may be that you are part of the traumatic experience that they're actually having, and that might be why, or it might be indirectly to do with you or something. So sometimes it's much easier to talk to somebody on the outside, and so that's kind of what I do. I talk, and that's what you're doing as well. You're that outside person saying, no, I do care, like, tell me what's going on. And do you find that many people open up to you about their actual experiences, or is it more that they can tell you that they're making improvements?
So we try not to get them to verbalise their experiences because we do primarily group work at the moment. And there's two different bits of the business. In fact, there's lots of different facets that I want to create. But if we talk about the current model, so we do group work up to about 12 individuals in the room. And as I mentioned earlier, some of them are staff. And so we don't want them to feel that they have to verbalise their experiences. Or my concern would be that they did verbalise something and then that triggered somebody else into their traumatic and re-traumatised them because they'd experienced something similar and it was buried so deep that they didn't want to think about it. So we do it all very kind of subjectively, and we get them to think about a traumatic experience, and it's called an SUD score, and it's a subjective unit of distress, SUD. It's on a scale of 1 to 10. And so we get them to think about the most recent traumatic experience that was roughly about a 5, so nothing extreme, but something that would be, once they've done the tapping, that they can genuinely measure a change in how their body is responding and feeling. So usually most of them say, oh, I've got something in mind, it's about a 6 or a 7. A couple of them might verbalise it, but it's nothing usually so traumatic as what they might have experienced in their younger years. And then we get them to do the techniques of the tapping, and then we get them to measure their SUD again, and invariably most of them have gone from a 7 to about a 3.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the feedback, because a lot of these guys have been stuck in cycles of addiction. And one of the guys, it was my best accolade, he goes, this is better than my benzos. I was like, woohoo! He's obviously feeling pretty chilled. But there is something called clinical EFT, which is a one-to-one with a trained therapist.
Okay.
It's much more rapid than talking therapy. So talking therapy you can have for 8, 9, 10 sessions and maybe feel that you're getting somewhere. Whereas each time that you have a clinical EFT session, you're literally processing the memory and parking it in the back of your brain and reducing the trauma that's associated with it and all the triggers. So what we want to do is lead on to, and that's what we'll be doing with the probation team, is identifying in the cohorts that we're working with guys that we think would benefit from some one-to-one work. Now, it is expensive, so I'm a social enterprise, so any profits that I make will go into subsidize the one-to-one, because that's where I think the real benefit is, working with the therapist, working through the issues. So
you're like the introductory session, you convince them that it can work, or they convince themselves, and then you
and then we work through that. But the other bit is, because of my own family situation, is to develop a family model. Because like you were saying, sometimes the family are too close to solve the problem, or are part of the problem inadvertently, or actively in part of the problem. And family dynamic is so important as well, about preventing cycles and just stopping the generational stuff. I'm sure you probably see it where you work, but I can speak to some of my friends who are clean and sober, but I can go, well, what did your dad do? Well, he was an alcoholic, and my mum was on drugs, and then my granddad was an alcoholic, and it goes back. And actually my daughter now, she's in her 30s, she's an alcoholic and an addict, and you just see it just cascade through the generations. And so the family aspect of it is about how can we help the families rebuild their relationships with each other, but also again help them to manage and relate better. Because if one's, your partner's gone off the deep end, do you just go rah 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 and have a go at them, or how do you manage the stress that's related with it, type thing? So, and particularly for children, I think it's really important that children are able to manage that and not get stuck in the cycle. So it's about cutting it off at that point in the stream as well.
Is it something that you have to do face to face? Is there any value of any like online sessions or anything like that? I'm just thinking about how it's knowledge. How can we open this up to more people? That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. And what we like to do is have the face-to-face sessions, but we would want to work in the prison. And so we are, it's interesting, yeah, the public purse and the spending review that's going on around, because we're obviously in austerity. It costs £50,000 to keep one person in prison 1 year, right? And if you think we've got 80,000 people and the conditions are appalling, you might see in the press every now and again, oh, they've got an Xbox or a TV. Well, yeah, so what? The prison's primary purpose is rehabilitation, but they get zero. Well, I wouldn't say zero. That's hardly any rehabilitation.
Very little, yeah.
That's the word I was looking for. Very little rehabilitation, and it really depends on the prison as well. So actually, the conditions are appalling, and suicide rates amongst prisoners are really high when you compare it to the general population. And then we've got a cohort called the IPP, which is an old sentence that's now been abolished, but we've still got 2,000 prisoners in our system, and they're on indefinite recall. So it's a life sentence. They can be out in the community and be recalled for the slightest thing. They can be out for 10 years and something happens. They're in the wrong place. They look at somebody wrongly and they can be recalled. It's a sentence that we're trying to get abolished, basically, or rectified, get justice for these. But sorry, long story short, in answer to your question, you were asking about non-face-to-face. Because the rules and regulations in prison mean that you can't have access to the internet, it makes it really difficult for us. And because, of course, when you're on the wing, you have to be released and you have to go, and quite often there's not the staff to release the prisoners to attend even medical appointments, let alone come to something like we're doing. So we are creating and working with a company that do in-cell Chromebooks, but they're not internet enabled, but we can load information onto it. So we can load little videos and they can do it themselves in their cells. And we're also working or hoping to work alongside the Samaritans project. Not that I've approached the Samaritans, but they have something called the listeners. The listeners are trained in their peers in prison. They're trained in active listening skills. And it would be lovely if that cohort were trained in this rapid therapeutic technique of EFT, that if they'd got somebody that was feeling suicidal or particularly anxious, and that person needed a listener, that actually the listener could actively listen, as well as teaching them to tap through the emotion of their distress as well. So we've got lots of things in the pipeline. And then I've still got the property thing that I'm trying to get off the ground.
No, that's good. Something I'm working on just recently, the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking about my thing that I'm doing. So I don't have a school yet. It doesn't exist. So I'm trying to work out what I can do while I'm still working full-time, so because I haven't left my job like you did, which was very brave. So I'm building like online courses and stuff, so I can try and, if I can't directly help the young people, how can I help other people help young people, if that makes sense? So maybe courses for parents, but also for teachers, other professionals. So I'm creating the Finfinch network, and I'm hoping that we can talk later about how maybe you could be part of that as well.
Yeah,
because I just think that there's so much learning to be had, and both what you and I do is quite taboo. So there'll be reports written by government saying how the government is failing these people, but then it'll be like, so now what are you going to do about it? They'll start talking about pots of money, but it doesn't materialize, or maybe it does, but I'm not really sure where it goes. So yeah, I think we've got lots more work to do together, Sharon.
Yeah. I think in answer to that question, it just goes into the big, the limited companies. You're a social enterprise as well, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, a community interest company, but it counts as a social enterprise, yeah.
Yeah, and it just is really difficult for us to break into these kind of large government public sector when you're up against, obviously I don't know your main competitors, but up against the likes of Sodexo and kind of the private providers that provide elements of support as well. To G4S as well, they work in the kind of justice sector, running private prisons, because we've got two sectors of prison. We've got private and we've got the public, HMPPS. And so for us, it's kind of like the limited company, we tend to have to be a CIC or a charity to even be able to get a look into some of that funding.
I've applied for lots of funding, and I mean that is a full-time job in itself, just applying for funding. So now I'm trying to think more along business model route. So part of the Finfinch network actually will be to try to onboard corporate companies that would like to increase their social impact.
Brilliant.
Which will look good upon them, that they're helping people, but not only will it make them look good, but also I could teach them how to train their staff, or I could train their staff so that they can help young people. And it might mean that we get not better workers. That doesn't sound good, but you know what I mean. If we can get more people into employment, which is part of it's not the whole issue, but it's some of the issue. Because a lot of people turn to crime because they're like, well, I have no money in my pocket, but I need, it's usually not food, it might be fags or something else. If they need something and they got that fight or flight, I need it now, what am I going to do? If they don't get to that point because they've got some money in their pocket, that might go some way into preventing them hitting the end of that road. So that's the line that I'm looking to go down at the moment. And then also joining the network with schools, youth groups, people like yourself, so that if I can, part of the network is about me linking together the corporate companies that want to do the good, what area of business do they work in, and which group can they work with to help those people, if that kind of makes sense. So
that sounds brilliant. I'd definitely love to help in any way you see fit that would align with your aims. So that's brilliant.
Thank you. Cool. That wasn't supposed to be about me pitching what I'm doing. Sorry. Head into that.
Well, I'm totally pitching what I'm doing. So
it's kind of like we have to, isn't it? Like you said, you can have a good idea, but having a good idea just is an idea. It doesn't formalize into an action unless you push it out there and tell people. So I guess that's what my podcast is partly about.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Your podcast is brilliant. I'd love to see your school off the ground. I think it's an amazing idea.
Oh, thank you. One day you can come see the school I already work at if you want to. That's pretty good as well. Cool. All right. Before we finish this off, is there anything else that you really wanted to share with people? Or have you got it all off your chest?
Oh, do you know what? I think I will just step back to the property side where this all came from.
Okay.
And because I do have a bee in my bonnet about the HMO style where these guys get put into. Okay. So I've just had an offer on a piece of land owned by a council down here.
Yeah.
And I live down on the south coast, and I put together a model. It was a community-based model. There was going to be 21 individual units on it. 7 of the units were going to be supported living for guys that had come out of prison, putting them through, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of educational pathways. It was going to be a community with a small holding, so trying to make it self-sustainable as well, because we are obviously rapidly heading, depending on which news you look at, to the cost of living crisis. But it's great to be able to I can consider it more to be therapeutic around mental health, being out in their garden, digging up I think again probably similar to what you have in mind for the school. And then the other 14 units were going to be affordable rent and social housing. And everyone that I've showed the proposal to, including the council, have said, yeah, it's amazing. We need it because we've got a real problem with vulnerable adults. And then, of course, you wait and you wait and you wait and then you wait, and then you chase up the agent that's dealing with the land, and then you find out it's just going to a standard housing developer. And I was offering more units on my site. And that the reason why I wanted 1-bed units is because of the HMO kind of thing. It just takes one person to relapse or to decide that they want to go down the criminogenic route again and steal something or break into something that then just topples the entire household over.
Because they might trigger the other people, yeah.
Exactly. And I see it time and time again with some of my friends that have recently come out of prison, and they're in hostels, they're in or they're in recovery, but then they relapse because they're in like an HMO style hostel. I just think that the strategy is wrong, but of course the whole way we do social housing could be better. I was just about to say it was wrong. I don't know. If any politicians watch this, I just say it could be better. It could be better. So I'm now looking for another piece of land to look and see if I can source and put the strategy together for that. That's my passion. Well, it's all my passion. But if I could get Ruka sorted out, then I can get 2911 done.
Yeah,
that's it.
It all sounds amazing. Well done to you for moving on your mission, because like I said, lots of people have good ideas but they don't actually move to make them happen. And I know that you've still got a long way to go, but the fact that you've made a start and you've come so far already, you should be super proud of yourself, and know that you'll go on to help many people. So well done.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll work together on your network. That would be amazing.
We definitely will be. All right then, thank you very much
for time. Take care. Bye.
Finch was set up to empower young people with the tools and confidence to achieve success. If you'd like to be part of our journey, please check out our website at www.finfinch.co.uk or email us at info@finfinch.co.uk.